Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer Sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade.
We chronicled the distinct memories of our childhood in our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s, which takes you on a notably historic journey through that often forgotten decade. We also want to hear about your experiences during the 1950s. We will feature guests whose special stories of that decade will bring to mind magical moments of reflection, some with tears, some with smiles, but above all, a good dose of laughter.
We would like you to chat with us as we bring to mind the sights and sounds so familiar to that time in history. Grab your favorite malt or Green River, make sure you are wide awake, and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Welcome on this day, this Valentine's Day, when this broadcast goes live in the evening. And we are excited to be with you today. Jackie and I are wearing red just in honor of the occasion, you might say. But thank you so much for joining us on the 1950s Fun Chat. We have a wonderful guest, a very knowledgeable guest who you will find fascinating with all of his experiences that he had in his young life, and especially in the 1950s. If you are a frequent visitor of this channel, or if you want to be a frequent visitor to this channel, please click the red subscribe button in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We would love to have you be made aware each time that a new Fun Chat is going to air on this channel. And so it just would make us happy, and we would just grow our channel. Is that right, Jackie?
That is right. And as you're perusing your screen looking for those buttons, notice the banner running across the bottom of the screen. It includes our website, which is called www.whilethewindmillwatch.com. And it will tell you all sorts of interesting things about our book and where you can buy it, what we've been doing, our Zooming situations. We have lots of Zooming information there. I also want you to look, please, up at the upper right-hand corner, and you'll see the cover of our book, and that's a beautiful North Dakota sunset, which wraps totally around it. And our book includes so many memories that Janine and I have of living in the Northern Great Plains in the 1950s. Now, as Janine mentioned, we do have an exciting guest for you today. His name is Duane Acker. Born in 1931 on a farm near Atlantic, Iowa, and now past 90, Duane Acker credits 4-H club membership and especially a lamb feeding project for prompting his desire to study animal husbandry at Iowa State University. That education led to a 33-year career teaching, advising students, and at university administration. After 11 years as president of Kansas State University, he served in the Reagan and the George H.W. Bush administrations, first with the Agency for International Development and later as the USDA Assistant Secretary. He then returned to operate his family farm in southwest Iowa. Dr. Acker, welcome. We're so glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you. I look forward to a visit.
Thank you. So, Dr. Acker, the 1950s held great change for you and your wife and Shirley and your 2 daughters. Now, I realize this is a large, open-ended question, but here it is. As you focus on those years in your field of education, what are a few of the changes students faced, beneficially or negatively, such as the Korean War, World War II, ROTC, administration or immunizations, teaching methods, student life, class registration, and more, of which I'm certainly not aware. All this in the 1950s. You're on.
Well, I'd start with entering as a freshman in the late 40s, 1948. Myself and classmates were very fortunate. We had as models the veterans of World War II. They were the juniors and seniors generally. I moved into a fraternity winter quarter of 49, and my my roommates were seniors in animal husbandry and veterinary medicine. And they were probably 8 years older than me, 6 to 8 years. They were good models. They were mature. They wanted to get through college and get on the job. They were in a hurry. They were serious. In contrast, when I was teaching in the mid 1950s, we were dealing with panty-raids. You see, and the juniors and seniors were themselves only a couple of years out of high school, and so they were probably leading the panty-raids. So it was quite a contrast in the environment. I'd say the students in 1948 to 1950 that I experienced, they were on the GI Bill. Had their lives interrupted generally, so they were demanding they wanted quality instruction. They wanted to be ripe and ready when they graduated for a good job. Mm-hmm. The students in 1955 had a different perspective on life, and they didn't have the models that we had. So again, we were very fortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So interesting. And of course, in that time when you were instructing at university level, you had the opportunity to become closer to many of those students as advisees.
Yes. In fact, I still correspond with a farmer in Oklahoma. I started teaching there in 1953. He would have been a freshman. He's now in his late 80s, and he's farming south of Perkins, Oklahoma. And so we exchange comment about our crops and the weather, etc. When I walked into a classroom in 1953 at Oklahoma State, I started on a PhD program. I'd finished my master's at Iowa State. Wanted a totally different environment, different part of the country. And so I was teaching freshman courses and teaching in animal husbandry and also teaching meat laboratories. I walked into my first classroom, and I had a bunch of, at that time, IBM cards with the new students on it.
Yeah.
And but what shocked me when I strode to the front of the room, here was a lieutenant colonel sitting on the front row as my student.
Yeah.
He looked to be about 45, had on a Army uniform. Well, I learned later that he was a member of the ROTC faculty that was going to retire soon. He wanted to go back to his farm in Arkansas, and so I learned a little bit about livestock. And I thought, well, how am I going to deal with this as a 22-year-old, and here's a 45-year-old? And so I'd been in ROTC, and I decided humor might be the best thing. So I said, when I got to his name and calling the roll, I said, I've been waiting for this for a long time.
Good for you.
And the students themselves also enrolled in ROTC. They got a big kick out of that.
Yeah.
And so we got along quite well. He's one I haven't retained contact with. He's probably long gone by now. But then I went back to Iowa State. But again, the teaching experience. Our first teaching at Iowa State was in judging livestock in the laboratory, but in the classroom, virtually no visual aids during the time I had been a student. But when I went back to start teaching, well, of course, we had the slide projectors, Kodachrome slides.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had a master's degree instructor who'd used some of the very elementary overhead projectors. And by this time, the 3M company and the Bessler company had devised an overhead projector that you could lay on a transparency and project it on the screen behind you, so you could draw pictures, you could do calculations, and that was a real innovation. And I really exploited that, because you could communicate so much more effectively in teaching ration formulation or in say the forms of livestock, whatever it might be. So quite a change in the visual aids.
Yes. And tell us, at that time, were most of those students then in animal science male students?
Yes, I would say that in each class of probably 100 students, there would be one girl.
Okay.
And it would be one of my fraternity brothers said if her dad had just bought her a horse when she was a kid, she'd get out of her system. You know.
Oh,
but ended up, he actually, honest, he ended up marrying that girl. And well, you may have known that girl was Duffy Stong, who was the butter cow at the Iowa State Fair.
Oh, sure.
Yes, and she and her husband, who happened to be my pledge father, they raised 8 kids on a farm in northeast Iowa.
Yeah.
And but now you see today, a majority of the students in animal husbandry and in veterinary medicine are young women, probably I would guess 70%. I don't have the exact figures. And not only that, but the dean is a woman. The two of the last several deans have been women. The dean of veterinary medicine, several of them have been women. The extension staff, a high proportion of them are women. So, and I consider that fantastic. I call that true freedom. True freedom from an academic standpoint, that a young woman or young man can pursue whatever discipline they want to pursue without any liability or any inhibition in terms of choosing a career. It's functioning to a greater extent with women than it is for men. For example, I see a smaller proportion, a lot of increase, but a smaller proportion of young men in foods and nutrition, or in child development, or in nursing, than I see women in engineering or agriculture, veterinary medicine.
Yes. Isn't it wonderful when people can pursue their dreams, what their heart's desire? And
the disturbing thing, perhaps for men, is that when I take a look at those students receiving honors in the College of Agriculture, if there are 10 pictured, there'll probably be 8 women and 2 men. And I'll share with you that one of the advisors about 10 years ago said that one of the biggest issues is that he put it this way: when a young man is 18, ready to go to college, he's still a boy. When a girl is ready for college 18, she's a young woman. In other words, women tend to mature a little bit more rapidly. Be more matured at age 18 or 19 than young men. That's just a biological observation, and we've known that for a long time. There's a change in on the average, and so it's really a totally different environment than I experienced in my early years of teaching, or certainly as a student.
Certainly. What I'd like to go back to, Dr. Acker, is that lamb feeding project that you had when you were a 4-H'er. And of course, lamb feeding is near and dear to my heart in our family, even as a child growing up on our farm in North Dakota. But then when my husband and I fed numerous lambs on our farm too in Iowa. But tell us how that became the nudge that inspired you to go into animal husbandry.
I'd say 2 ways. First of all, my father was rather reticent about 4-H work, and we had not joined when at first eligible, because it seemed at that time that the more the focus was on winning a blue ribbon and maybe overspending for a calf to have a great chance of getting a blue ribbon, and rather than a commercial experience. And Dad was feeding lambs, feeding cattle, milking cows, but a new project evolved in the fall of 1946. I was started to be a junior in high school, and it included a lamb feeding project. You could a unit of 16 lambs. You could have 2 units of 32. And I recall going, and the county agent recruited me and a few others to participate in the project so they could get a carload of lambs. And I recall going down on a Sunday and helping unload lambs. My sister enrolled, I enrolled, and also a young man that had dropped out of school and working for my dad. The 3 of us all enrolled, so we had 16 times 6 lambs to put on feed. Learned to keep records. We went to a show in Des Moines, not fitting and showing, but just appraising with meat processors, buyers, the quality of the lambs along in March. And so it was a truly commercial experience. In that show in Des Moines, I met a couple of the livestock extension people from Iowa State and a 4-H club leader, because they checked our record books. We brought along our record books to show at that show at the State Fairgrounds in Des Moines in March 1947. And then, of course, the county agent would take us to, he got talked us into joining the judging team. And it took us to Iowa State for workouts, got acquainted with the campus, to the Iowa State Fair, met more people, and then fall of 1948 enrolled. So that was really the vehicle.
You mentioned about getting a carload of lambs. Number of head on that at night, were they about 100 pounds, 110 pounds?
I would say they were more likely about 80. They might have been,
All right.
I unfortunately don't have my record book. It was kept for many, many years. But I remember more weighing out the feed, and I was recording exactly how many pounds of grain, how many pounds of supplement, et cetera. And I remember also going out every morning, every cold morning, and making sure the light was on underneath the heater so they could have. We're getting plenty of water.
Yes. Did that carload of lambs come from the Omaha stockyards?
I would assume. I do not recall. It may have come directly from Wyoming, or I just do not know. There were probably several students involved, and I have no idea how many lambs. There were 5 or 6 of us that enrolled in that project.
Okay. Yes. And did that project continue on for a number of years in 4-H?
I do not know. I was in it for 2 years, and then was through with 4-H. Went to college. I simply do. Well, I'll share with you when at that event at the state fairgrounds. I recall we had a little judging contest also in that process, and 10 years later, I was teaching animal nutrition to the juniors in veterinary medicine at Iowa State. And I went down through the roll, and here was a name I recognized, Jimmy Maxted from Oskaloosa, Iowa. He had the top lamb in the judging that was done at that Iowa State Fairgrounds.
Yes.
10 years earlier. So before class, I went down to the extension office and talked with Tommy Wickersham. I said, "You got any records from those early years?" He went into his files and he pulled out Jimmy Maxted's record for that lamb feeding project. And I took it to class, and we had a good time.
Oh, how fun.
Yeah, so Jim was a few years younger than me. He probably was early in his 4-H career.
Did he continue? Do you recall if he continued on feeding lambs?
I have no idea. By that time, he was a junior in veterinary medicine, so his lambs may be long gone. And I'd have to look at the Iowa State alumni director to know where he might be at this stage.
Yes. Well, you've had some very interesting experiences in Washington, D.C. Can you tell us about those, please?
Well, after leaving the presidency, of course, we'd had a lot of contact with the U.S. Agency for International Development because Kansas State, first Iowa State had a project in Argentina that I was involved in, but Kansas State had projects in India and in the Philippines and in Botswana in Southern Africa. And so as president, we had traveled to at least the Philippines and Botswana with those projects. And so I knew quite a few of the people in USAID, and it looked to me like I was quite interested in international agriculture. So after completing the presidency, we put a 10 years on the limit on the presidency. That was long enough for anybody to be in one job. Wanted to have some new and different experiences. So I was asked to come in to head the food and agriculture programs of USAID. I'd explain. Well, number one, it does a lot of excellent work, but USAID is a very, very bureaucratic agency. There's a lot of bureaucracy in Washington, obviously, and a little bit in universities too. But one thing you observe is the AID has no domestic constituency except for the people who might provide some of the genetic material or some of the equipment that the AID finances to send overseas, or certainly food aid. So the soybean and corn growers, they're a constituency. But USDA has a very domestic constituency. So if things go wrong in an agency, you can bet that the commodity groups are going to be calling the White House and the Secretary of Agriculture, and things get straightened out in a hurry.
Mhm.
AID doesn't have that. It's a very, very bureaucratic organization. But there's a lot of wonderful people in the organization who do good work. But it's controlled pretty much by the Senate leadership. They have the right to approve or disapprove projects going overseas, depending on what the political implications might be. And so there's a lot of bureaucracy interaction with Congress.
So you use the term projects. What does that entail? Or what,
Well, if for example for AID, we'd have agriculture staff in country. Let's say in Indonesia, the island of Sumatra. For decades, they've been trying to move population from Java to Sumatra, which has poorer soils, try to decrease their population in Java. So to do that, they have to improve the soil quality. So AID was financing a soils fertility project in Sumatra, and so one of my jobs, shall I say, general supervision, but we had a project leader and a mission in Indonesia. One of my first experiences was to go to Indonesia and take a trip out to the island of Sumatra, and work with the local people. The extension workers, if you please use that term, were on motorcycles. The farmers where we had demonstration projects, they were dealing with 1 or 2 hectares or maybe 3 to 5 acres, and they might have 1 cow, and they were cultivating. They would have maybe have an orchard, and so I wanted to see those projects in action, recommending trying to learn how to develop the fertility of the soil, conserve water, avoid wind erosion or avoid water erosion, that type of thing. That's what I'd call a project.
Okay, so the people who were actually there in directing the project were from universities, and they were working with the locals, and then
they were working with the locals. They might have been an AID employee with a bachelor's degree in agriculture, perhaps agronomy. They might have been somebody who'd been with the university and had retired. They might have been on sabbatical leave for 6 months or a year.
Okay.
It might have been a former county agent. And of course, all of this activity was modeled on what a predecessor agency had done with Japanese agriculture after World War II, when General MacArthur was in charge of the government in Japan, and they brought a lot of U.S. county agents over to teach them some modern agriculture in Japan, and then in South Korea, and so it was modeled after that, and the agency was then developed as the Agency for International Development, and a lot of money put into it.
Did you have the flexibility to lend your input into potential changes, what was going on previously?
Some, I'd say probably less so, because again, the bureaucracy. To get a project approved, for example, if somebody wanted to, say, shift that project in Indonesia from working on soils to maybe look at varieties of rice, they couldn't just get approval from their project director. It had to come to DC and be reviewed by well, we had a policy bureau. Was it consistent with governmental policy? And then had to go to the Southeast Asia Bureau. And then I was in the Bureau of Science and Technology. It had to go through our bureau. So it took a lot of, and then eventually when say if a couple $1 million was going to be approved for it, you had to check with any U.S. senator that might be interested to see if he had any objection to it.
Sure.
Or a senatorial staff member who might have been watching some of the activity. So things moved rather slowly.
Yes. So maybe the wheels of bureaucracy do move slowly, and would it be like a year or more before anything actually got done?
Uh, could be, could be, it could be. But I will share with you that one of my most rewarding experiences was in our human nutrition program, where I brought in a person who what I'd call social psychology, social psychology. That in dealing with the northern South American countries, for example, the elders are so highly respected. In the United States, we kind of poo-poo the people that get past 65, and the young people take over, and that's where all the wisdom seems to be, is in the younger people. But down there, the grandmother or the great-grandmother is the one who is revered. And so we brought in this social psychologist who'd written a couple of books, and they got our staff together and say, okay, now that tells us that we need to target our educational programs toward the grandmother.
Yes, yes.
And convince her that those kids, those grandchildren need vitamin A, they need green leafy vegetables, they get nutrition. And once she's convinced, it'll happen.
Yes, yes. Well, Dr. Acker, I'm going to go back a little on a little bit different subject. It lends itself to your commercial lamb feeding project, but at that time in the 50s and 60s, and even as we went into the next decade, university professors and extension staff, university professors in animal husbandry were very important judges in the livestock show ring throughout the United States. And how do you envision the change in the show ring from the 50s to even the last part of the last century, and how did that all affect the commercial livestock industry by what was done in the show ring?
I'd say the show ring has overall less significance, much less significance than in the 1950s, because when step one was in the 1950s, when we started using carcass data along with the show ring competition to judge, to give the final award to the participants. And I recall yet a visit in about 1957 on whether the International Livestock Show in Chicago should start using carcass data. And it was quite a debate. And former Dean Kildee was on the committee, and he was one of the drivers. He said, "Times have changed. We need to be more quantitative. Need to be much more quantitative." And of course, it showed up in my teaching, as I say, in my labs as a student. The labs were all livestock judging.
Sure.
When I went back to teach, it was obvious that I needed to bring into the classroom the probing of pigs to measure the back fat. I need to use selection indexes, 205-day weight for calves, the growth rate, the birth weight, the livability data for dairy cows, rate of gain for feeder cattle. I had to use feeder cattle in my laboratories. Had to have a workbook with a lot of quantitative data. So it was quite a change. And of course that has accelerated now tremendously. I don't know how I would behave in a livestock animal husbandry laboratory today. I don't know whether in the classroom I'd probably be teaching genetic engineering.
Yes.
Which lines? In my time it was rotation crossbreeding for hogs, but today it's genetic lines. The breeds have virtually disappeared.
Yes, that's true. Dr. Acker, we're getting towards the end of our broadcast today. Well, I have a couple questions, though, I'd like you to answer that I usually ask each guest. And the first one is, what influenced you the most in the 1950s that had an imprint on the rest of your adult life?
Probably the guidance of the department heads and major professors under whom I worked. My instructor in junior nutrition is one that was so enthusiastic, got me involved in doing a special problem as a junior and a senior, and eventually did graduate work. And then the department heads at Oklahoma State and Iowa State showed an interest, encouraged, gave me all the freedom in the world to try new ideas and support. And I learned an awful lot from them. And then I would say the Louis Thompson, Associate Dean at Iowa State, on advising students, had the philosophy that every student has got a potential, and our task is to understand what that potential is and then help them get as far as they can go in that potential. For example, if we test our soil to decide how much fertilizer to put on, then for kids, you better look at the ACT scores and you better look at the high school transcript to see whether they can handle chemistry or English, or whether they need remedial work, and how far they can go, how much fertilizer you should put on them.
Sure.
How much stimulation.
What a great parallel that is.
Oh, good advice.
Yes. And then also from the 1950s, is there one fun memory that comes to mind of that time?
Of the 1950s, yes. And went back as assistant secretary to visit a corn breeding project at Iowa State that USD was financing. And the scientist himself, a member of the National Academy, had a man beside him, his technician. And he gave him a lot of credit for it. And so I went up to him and I said, I looked at him, I recognize him. And I said, Jim, you deserve a lot. I went up to the young man and I said, we've been acquainted. And he said, you bet we were. You were my advisor.
Okay. Okay. Wonderful. Well, what awesome experiences that you had. And we are so thankful that you have taken the time to share them with us on the Fun Chat. It's very wonderful information to broaden our expanse of that 1950s decade. Thank you, Dr. Duane Acker from Atlantic, Iowa, for being our guest this week on the 1950s Fun Chat.
Thank you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much.
Yes, we have fun doing this. So, Jackie, it's been a great half hour of conversation with Dr. Acker, and we do certainly look forward to next week's guest. Can you tell us anything about who's upcoming or what's
No,
happening?
I cannot. It's a surprise. But I do want you people who are watching to be sure to click on that red subscribe button and the thumbs up icon, and tell your friends, even your relatives, about the 1950s Fun Chat. So do join us live every week on Monday, 8 p.m. Central. But if you can't join us at that time, view our YouTube channel, and it's found at the 1950s Fun Chat.
Just in case you want to learn more about the Pfeiffer Sisters, Jackie and me, you can go to our website where that information will be given. Also, more information on the book, where you can purchase the book, and all of our vendors who are carrying the book, along with the NDSU bookstore, who is our international distributor and can send one or multiple copies of our book to you. And please note that Jackie and I take great delight in zooming into libraries, into school classrooms, into events of social groups and organizations as the program for those particular events. We just contact us through our website and we can set up a date to Zoom with you. We love to talk about the 1950s and our time then, and in some cases it's a forgotten decade, but we do bring history alive to those events. So we hope that until next time, you remember those great years of bobby socks, poodle skirts, soda jerks, and cool cars. And we'll see you next time on the 1950s Fun Chat.
And we appreciate and thank each and every one of you, our viewers.